So a work breakdown structure, or WBS, is just a delivery-oriented hierarchical decomposition of work. It is used to define the total scope of the project and to identify required deliverables for the project. Now, project deliverables and work are divided into small, manageable components. It's called a work package, which is the lowest level of any WBS. They can be scheduled, there's a cost estimated, and they're monitored and controlled individually. So let's take a look at this example of a telephone manufacturing project. Now, the WBS includes everything which will form the final project. Anything that is not listed in the WBS will not be a part of the final product. In this case, it's the telephone. Risk. Now, risk is an uncertain event or consequence that will probably occur during a project. Risk impacts at least one of the four main project objectives, which is time, cost, quality, and scope. Now, risk can be positive and enhance the success of a project, as well as negative and pose a threat to the project's success. Now, there are some terms used in risk analysis and management that we need to understand. The likelihood that a risk will occur is called risk probability. This is to assess any risk is to assess the probability and impact of that risk. Now, an issue is the occurrence of a risk, and risk consequences are the effect on the project objectives if there is an occurrence of a risk or an issue. Now, risk analysis and management is crucial to the success of a project. Now, risk analysis can be split up into a 5-step process. It begins by identifying risk. Now, potential risks are identified using qualitative techniques like interviewing, brainstorming, or maybe a balanced check sheet. The next step is to evaluate that risk. Now, identified potential risks are evaluated using the quantitative method, which is the 3 criteria of occurrence, severity, and detection. It's an FMEA. Now, those identified risks are prioritized based on their RPN number. Counter or preventative measures for those risks are then brainstormed. Then we're going to implement that, and the identified countermeasures are then implemented. And then finally, we're going to monitor and control. The whole project will be monitored and controlled so that the risk and the impact are under control. Now, there are some basic elements of a risk analysis. The first thing that we have to get are these things called qualitative methods, which are our interviews, our checklists, and our brainstorming, which are used to identify our potential risks. The next one is that quantitative method, which is where we use to evaluate the cost, the time, and the probabilistic combination of the individual uncertainties. And then we have feasibility, which is a study of the project risk. Then there's a potential impact, which is determining the impact of potential risks on a project. And then we already talked about our RPN, which is an RPN of a failure of the product of its probability using occurrence, severity, and detectability. Avoiding risk, and if the potential impact is huge, then avoiding the risk is the best option. Mitigating risk is where the loss from mitigating a risk is much less of a loss from temporarily avoiding the risk. And then we have accepting the risk. And if a risk cannot be avoided or mitigated, then it has to be accepted. The risk will be accepted if it doesn't greatly impact the cost, time, and the product objective. So there are some benefits to risk analysis. The first one would be that identified risks can be mitigated, transferred, or accepted. When a risk is identified in a task, slack time is provided as a buffer. Thus, identifying risks helps in setting up actual timelines for a project. And identifying risks helps in setting realistic expectations from the project by communicating the risk probability and the consequences to stakeholders. And then contingency plans can be developed to identify that risk, and the project team is then well prepared to work on the issue, thereby reducing the impact of the risk. So the potential risks of a project are assessed using the risk assessment matrix. Now, the risk assessment matrix is split up into really 5 columns. The first column represents the type of risk that we're assessing. The first column looks at the risks of monetary loss. The second column looks at the risk of productivity loss. The third column is the risk of resources. And then the last column is the risk of customer confidence loss. And we basically just start rating them high, medium, or low. So is it a high risk of monetary loss? Is it a medium risk of productivity loss? Is it a low risk of the risk of resources? So let's go through an example. So let's say that we're looking at the scope of our project. And the first one would be milestones. So I'm just going to write milestones as the risk that I'm looking at. And then we're going to just assess it. Well, based upon the milestones and how that's defined within our project, we might say that that's going to have a medium risk of financial loss or monetary loss. Now, in terms of a risk of productivity loss, that could be high because we might not be necessarily meeting our milestone objectives. We might not be meeting our milestone objectives because of a risk of resources. So that might also be high. And then the risk of customer confidence, we could say that could be low at the beginning. Let's look at another one. Let's say that with our team, we're looking at the selection of our team. So we can just put team members, right? Well, is there a huge, medium, or low financial risk of loss? Well, right now we're going to say that that's going to be low. There could be a huge productivity loss in terms of our selecting the right team members, so that could be still high. Risk of resources is probably low, and the risk of customer confidence we'll just say is low for the example purpose. So now we have two items within our risk that we have to look at. Now, in this particular case, the risk of financial loss in just these two items is kind of low. It's medium. It's on the lower end of our scale. But here, we are ranking both of these as a high risk of productivity. This one, when we average them together, that's medium and that's incredibly low. So we don't really need to look at that one. We don't need to look at this one, but we kind of need to look at these two here. Because our milestones have two high risks, we need to make sure that we keep this incredibly within our sight and that we manage to that risk so that those risks don't actually occur with product loss or a risk of losing our resources. So the risk assessment matrix is just a really good way for us to start writing down what our risks are. And not only that, but it helps us to start understanding where we need to apply our resources to mitigate those risks. So every project requires closure because without a formal closure process, project teams can fail to recognize the end. And then the project can just drag on, sometimes at a great expense. Now, project closure really ensures that the outcomes match the stated goals of the project, that the customers and stakeholders are happy with the results, and critical knowledge is always captured. And also that the team feels a sense of completion and that project resources are released for the new projects. Now, this is a project closure report that is created to accomplish the following goals. We're going to review and validate the success of the project, and we're going to generate our project control recommendations. We're going to generate discussions and recommendations, and then we're going to provide a synopsis of the process. We're going to evaluate the project performance and then summarize the planned activities of the project. We're then going to provide a project background overview and provide the project report or summary. Then we're going to highlight the best practices for the future projects and outline tasks and activities that were accomplished to complete this activity. And then finally, we're going to confirm outstanding issues, limitations, and recommendations before closing the project out. So during project closure, the project manager needs to take care of the following activities. It begins by finalizing the project documents and then capturing the project knowledge. We're going to set up a project library and document the project learnings. Then we're going to provide our knowledge transfer to the work team. Then we're going to get a final sign-off from our sponsor, and then we're going to close out the project office. We will recognize and reward the great work that our team has done, and we will celebrate our successes. Then we will make our final public announcement, and then we'll conclude the project. And this concludes topic 3. In topic 4, we will discuss management and planning tools.